The movie begins with Carroll Shelby reminiscing his winning from demanding 1959 24 hours of Le Mans endurance race. Then suddenly, a doctor repeatedly calls Shelby's name as he reports that his heart rate is critically at risk and that he can no longer race anymore. Shelby then drinks the pill as he engines his car and drives recklessly on the road. In garage, Peter Miles is playing with his toy car, while his father, Ken Miles, is entertaining the customer who complains about his car that clogs up. As Ken advises on correctly driving the vehicle, the customer walks out and throws curses at him. Afterwards, Molly, Ken's wife, enters the garage and flirts with her husband. A while later, on the Ford factory, Vice President Henry Ford II tells his grandfather's legacy in building the Ford Motor Company. While everyone is listening, Henry orders his employees to contemplate and give their idea to keep their job. Afterwards, Phil knocks on the camper van to wake Shelby. Later, a race control marshal disqualifies Ken's racing car for not meeting the Class A competition requirement. On the other hand, Dieter Voss compliments Ken on his discussion with Phil and Shelby. As Shelby speaks about Ken's awards, he suddenly hears Ken's arguing with the race control marshal. Unfortunately, Dieter sees Ken's unethical behavior and walks out. So Shelby tells Ken about the sponsorship of Dieter, yet Ken rudely throws his wrench at Shelby. As the car race begins with a flying start, Shelby watches Ken compete when suddenly Sam appears behind his back and mocks his reason for forced retirement from the race. While the commentator talks, Ken successfully wins the race. Luckily, Dieter sees it, and at the same time, Shelby orders Phil to frame Ken's wrench. Later that night, Molly tells Ken about the IRS. She says that it buggers her while the IRS padlocks their garage. So Ken says that he'll figure something out. In the meeting room, Lee reports about his plan for the Ford company to go racing. But Henry stops him while the Ford executive asks why Henry should listen to him. Lee then tackles Enzo's Ferrari's history of being the most outstanding car manufacturer of all time, where his cars are not being built but what his cars mean. Victory: Ferrari wins at Le Mans. And people want that kind of victory. If Ford beats the Ferrari at their own game, they will be the most outstanding car manufacturer. The following day, Ken tries to give up racing to save their garage, yet Molly refuses and suggests that he continues his car racing. Lee arrives at the Ferrari factory a while later. Then he meets Enzo Ferrari, drinking his coffee at racing department. Lee talks about merging their companies with two form entities at Ferrari's office. Ferrari Ford, 90% owned by Ford, who controls all production, while Ferrari Ford, race team, is 90% owned by Ferrari. Then after speaking, Ferrari tells Lee that he will read the paper first. After a few minutes of waiting, Lee, unfortunately, receives a no from Ferrari for insulting him in his proposal. Then Ferrari suddenly mocks Henry in his company. Later, Henry reads the news about Fiat successfully buying Ferrari. Then he asks Lee about the insults from Ferrari about his company. Afterwards, Henry orders Lee to find the best engineers and drivers to build a race car. Lee meets with Shelby the following day. Upon entering Shelby's office, Lee tells him that Henry wants to win the 24-hour of Le Mans race against the Ferrari and that he wants Shelby to build the car. So, Shelby explains how great Ferrari company is in car racing, implying that Ferrari is too hard to beat. But then he tells Lee about a guy that will get him a shot for the race, which is Ken. That evening, Shelby talks to Ken and tells him that he has a proposition. Shelby then explains that Ken will build a car within 90 days for a car racing. Ken laughs and asks if Ford will allow them to make a car that he wants. But Shelby remains silent. As Ken refuses, Shelby favors him to come on Sunday to the launching of the Mustang and listen to his speech about the race program. Sunday comes. Ken and Peter arrive at Cloverfield where the launching is happening. While Ken is listening to Shelby's speech about partnering with the Ford company, he suddenly walks out with Peter. Outside Ken's house, he sees Shelby waiting on his arrival. Shelby invites him for a ride to show something to Ken. Unfortunately, Molly sees them through the window. On arrival at the airport apron, Shelby shows Ken a Ford GT40 Mk1 high-performance racing car. Seconds later, Kevin drives the vehicle along the apron while Shelby watches him. Afterwards, Ken tells the car's issues. But Ken quickly rides the vehicle again when Shelby asks if Ken sees anything else as an issue. Ken practices riding the race car to check the parts that they will put for the GT40 car. While Ken takes another ride using the other racing car, Shelby talks with Baby about Ken's abilities in building a car. At the same time, building the best racer, yet, Baby shows in doubt about Ken. At the car factory, Shelby calls Ken for a talk, as Ken discusses the part that he will put in GT40. Shelby suddenly announces that he will not come with them, Le Mans race, for he is not a good image in racing. That afternoon, Ken listens to Le Mans race radio while working with the cars that he keeps on mentioning the misplacement parts. In the Ford's racing car, as he listens, then suddenly, Molly appears at his workplace and comforts Ken as they drink together. At the Ford company, Shelby explains everything to Ford that despite losing the competition, Ford's race car becomes faster than the Ferrari, and he also tells it Enzo finds it out as a threat. Fortunately, Shelby finally earns Henry's trust to lead. Later, Shelby watches Ken on the street as he walks outside his house, then he tells the good news to Ken that he will build the GT40 with him again. As Ken listens, Shelby asks him if he still needs to apologize, but Ken only punches his face. Ken and Shelby begin to fight as Molly takes a chair and sits in the background to watch them fight across the street. Ken and Shelby spend their days practicing and building the GT40. While Ken practices riding the race car, Shelby receives a call from Lou that BB will be in charge, and once Ken gone, Ken loses his brakes, exploding. Luckily, Ken survives. Afterwards, Ken tells Phil to design a new assembly, but Phil tells otherwise. Phil suggests swapping out the entire braking system that includes rotors for GT40, but Ken asks him if they can change parts, so Phil answers yes. Later, Shelby asks about Ken's condition, but Ken cuts Shelby off and asks him to spell out what he wants to say. So Shelby says that what they're doing is under control by BB, and Shelby tells Ken to trust him as he makes a high-risk plan. BB and Henry arrive at their workplace the following day. BB suddenly excuses Shelby for a talk. Inside Shelby's office, BB opens up about him being in charge of the executive director of the racing program. Shelby only gives him a nod as he walks himself out of the office and locks BB inside. As BB shouts for help, everyone in the car factory ignores him and begins their scheme. While Shelby, on the other hand, distracts Henry by suggesting he ride the car with him. Then Shelby starts the car engines and drives faster. Minutes later, Shelby stops the car while Henry suddenly starts sobbing as he realizes that driving a racing car is not a machine where anybody can get in and quickly control. Shelby then adds that Ken is the only man who can win in Le Mans race. While they talk, Ken suddenly arrives. Later that night, Shelby wins the deal with Henry as Ken finally takes the seat to compete in Ford's program race for Le Mans' upcoming event race. As Shelby and Phil watch Ken in the track race, Ken sees Hank's son smirking at him. Then suddenly, Ken witnesses Hank's son hitting one of the racers' cars to explode. Luckily, Ken dodges it. Ken gets back to the pit stop to refuel and change tires, then he talks to Shelby about Hank's son, who successfully takes out the Mustang on the track race. Phil approaches Shelby and asks why the other marshals are much faster fixing than them. So Shelby says that they have a NASCAR crew. After 23 hours of racing in Daytona, the event continues. He sees Lee and the other Ford company officials tossing drinks to celebrate the race program. Then he suddenly writes 7,000 plus, go like hell on the placard and walk toward the trace rack to show it to Ken. Luckily, Ken reads it and follows Shelby's orders. Meanwhile, Ken waits for his timing and speeding his car, and when he gets Hank's son in the track race, he shouts at him and quickly pulls his gear lever and follows the RPM that Shelby says in the placard. Then luckily, Ken wins the race. Henry receives a call at the meeting room inside the Ford Motor Company, saying that Ford won Daytona. After announcing it to the producers, Henry asks which team is it. After celebrating the Shelby American team's victory, Ken spends his night with his family. Then later, while Molly is sleeping beside him, Ken checks Peter, still awake and drawing a map. Ken enters his room and teaches his son his map track tips. Ken arrives in France the following day. While resting in St. Peter Hotel, Ken goes outside and strolls around the track race. As he walks, he suddenly hears Shelby and sees him sitting on the pit stop counter, drinking. Ken and Shelby share a small talk. That night, the following day, the Le Mans race begins. Ken and Shelby receive a piece of news that's graffiti in Bandini. Our Ferrari's racers. As the commentators orders the racers to line up, Ken wears his helmet and positions himself. Seconds later, the call race begins with a flying start. Ken quickly runs towards his car and starts his engine. As Ken drives, he suddenly loses his focus because of his car's door, and the Bandini Ferrari takes first place after one lap. Ken complains about his car that doesn't close up on reaching the pit stop. Then the marshals quickly assemble it. Yet the door still won't close because something's hitting the window frame. So, Phil gets a mallet to fix the car door. Ken then rapidly gets back as Ford and Shelby intensely watch his race. Fortuitously, the commentator announces Ken's new lap record in just 3 minutes. As Ken continues racing, Ronnie tells Shelby that Ken's pushing the car too hard, which is not part of their plan, but Shelby answers him of changing plans. On the second lap, Ken sets a new record again. Later, Ken arrives at a pit stop and takes his break. While Ken talks to Shelby, they hear the commentator talking about the incident on turn 6. Then it is followed by the incident of Ferrari number 20, who's taking out from the track. Then Shelby clicks as his stopwatch to record Ken's other lap. Then it's later, the commentator announces Ken and Bandini locking in a battle against the elements as they push their cars to the limit. Pass in the White House corner. BB then calls one of the marshals to write the RPM on the placard and shows it to Ken. Luckily, Shelby sees BB's scheme, but unfortunately, he's too late to stop the marshal. As Ken follows what he sees on the placard, his brakes suddenly shot, making Bandini take the lead. Ken then takes his car to the pit stop to repair the brakes. While the marshal are fixing it, the Italians from Ferrari team informs the men who's in charge and monitoring the pit stop. The man says it's against the rules, but Ken argues that the man shows their book where Ken's team cannot swap out the system to disqualify them. Shelby then pacifies Ken and lets him talk with the man. A while later, Ferrari arrives at his pit stop, while Ken intensely looks at Scarfieri, who's taking his turn to drive the Ferrari. Then Ken quickly gets inside his car after seeing Scarfieri drive. Ken successfully takes the lead after passing Bandini twice on the track race. Shelby asks about Bandini, so his team says that the Ferrari is done and that all 3 fours are leading along with Ken upon Henry's arrival. BB asks for a favor to line up all the 3 fours together to make a historical moment for Ford. Then BB quickly informs Shelby about it after Henry agrees with him. Furiously, Shelby tells BB to take his hand off to Ken, but BB is too persuasive, telling Shelby that it's what Henry wants. But in the end, Shelby tells Ken that it's his choice and it's up to him what he's going to do with the last-minute race. As Ken breaks his record and virtually guarantees first place, Ken eventually chooses to slow down and wait for his team so that they will cross the line together, making a historic moment for Ford at Le Mans' 66 race. However, as the race finishes, Ken finds out that Enzo robs the race, announcing McLaren as the winner instead of him. The movie ends with Ken ending up in his driver's seat in the sky after the Le Mans race. At the same time, Shelby mourns for a long time and begins having difficulty picking the best car racer like Ken. On the other hand, Shelby became one of the most successful and celebrated sport car designers in the history, while Ken received a recognition in the Motorsports Hall of Fame. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. See you in the next video.